And welcome to those who've joined us already for our online session today on Legal Intercept on the cheap. We'll just give it another minute before we start, giving people plenty of time to join. So please be patient with us. Okay, I think that's probably given everybody enough time to join us, or at least for us to get started anyway. Welcome to all of those people who've joined us for yet another one of our online sessions. And this time we hope this will be a really useful, practical session for all of our technical members out there in ISP and telco land. The session this week, this session is on Lawful Intercept on the cheap, or Legal Intercept on the cheap, and we've got some great speakers, and one which has just joined us at the last minute, who'll be able to join us in our panel session right at the very end, which we're really thrilled to have on board. Okay, so let's move on to a little bit of housekeeping. Well, if we were present in the same room together, I would be pointing out the emergency exits. But I hope none of us will have emergencies, and none of you will have emergencies either, so we don't really care where the exits are. We will be sending out a feedback survey tonight, actually this afternoon. And we'll be asking you in that for any comments you've got on improvements to our sessions, any future topics you'd like, things like member demos or presentations, or even good old peering socials. We'd be happy to run those. Do let us know what you think of this session and of any other sessions you'd like us to run. A couple of fine print things I need to point out. The presentation part of this session is going to be recorded and will be put onto our website for your future enjoyment, should you not take in everything today, or you want to come back onto something, or even share it with your friends and colleagues. During these, our organisation of these events, the Internet Association of Australia Board adopted a code of conduct for our events, which means that when we are in participation mode, we do expect that people will be respectful of each other and accept and support each other to participate in these. And if you can't play nicely, folks, we will kick you out. You may appeal, but we won't readmit you to the session at this time. This applies both to our speakers, who we have carefully vetted, of course, beforehand, but to our participants who are participating in both the chat and panel question and answer session later. Now, if you do have any questions that you'd like to pose throughout the course of this, please type them into the Q&A part of the good old Zoom webinar, or into the chat. We will be monitoring those, and we appreciate getting those questions from you. We won't be answering them until the end of the session, so please hold on to those, and hopefully we'll get to them in a reasonable sort of priority. Okay, on to the next part. I'd like to introduce to you Sophia Jew. Sophia is our policy officer here at the Internet Association of Australia. She's just recently completed her law degree, but during this time she has been working in this field, so she's got some great experience, and she'll give you an overview of how things work. Over to you, Sophia.
So thank you for the introduction, Narelle, and good afternoon, everyone. As Narelle said, I'm the policy officer at IAA, and I'm just going to give you a quick overview of how lawful interception works in Australia. And let me just get my screen up. Okay, So in general, the act of interception or accessing private communications that occurs over telecommunication services without the knowledge of those involved in that communication is prohibited. But there are circumstances where in the interest of national security or for law enforcement, where it is actually legally permissible for law enforcement and other agencies to intercept that communication. And so ISPs will have to comply and help agencies in such in the act of intercepting such communication. And so the legislation that governs when such interception is permitted is the Telecommunications Interception and Access Act of 1979, and this is administered by the Department of Home Affairs. So it's a pretty broad instrument, but it sets out the process of when such interception is lawful and how it's lawful under the Act. So others who are involved and covered under the Act includes carriers, and carriers are defined, it takes the same definition as it is in the Telecommunications Act. Put simply, if you have a carrier license, as well as carriage service providers for the most part, except in parts 5.4 and 5.4a, which both relate to ICPs or interception capability plans, which we will get to in a little bit. And in those circumstances, it only applies to nominated CSPs. And so if you are a carriage service provider and you are a nominated carriage service provider, you will only become so under a minister's declaration, and you will be notified if you become a nominated CSP. It also includes law enforcement and other interception agencies. So of course, that's your AFP, the state police, but also other commissions like ICAC, for example, or the Crime Commission, as well as ASIO, and that's under the powers of the Attorney General. And the other individual or group is the Communications Access Coordinator, which typically is the Secretary of the Department of Home Affairs or another personal body that's specified by a minister in another legislative instrument. So the process and how you may be subject to complying with a lawful intercept request is that agencies must apply for a warrant, and they will apply for that warrant with an eligible judge or a nominated member of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. And this will typically occur if there is a serious offense that the law enforcement agency is investigating, and serious offense covers a whole host of different offenses, but broadly or usually speaking, they are offenses that are punishable imprisonment for life or a max period of at least 7 years. And when it comes to bodies like ASIO, then that's obviously a matter where it concerns national security, and so interception is required under those circumstances as well. There are also very limited occasions where agencies may be able to lawfully intercept communications throughout the use of a warrant, and that's in very urgent cases. So the example is under Section 30, where the police might need a telecommunications provider to trace the location of a caller to prevent an imminent death or someone becoming seriously injured. And obviously, because of the urgent nature of those circumstances, getting a warrant is just not possible or practical. So now if we're getting to what your obligations are under the Act. So the main one is the interception capability, where a minister may make a determination into what sort of interception capabilities are specified for a particular type or kind of telecommunication service. And if so, that determination will be based on specified international standards. There is no such determination that exists for ISPs. That doesn't mean that obviously carriers and CSPs aren't subject to complying with obligations, because there are obligations that as a carriage service provider or as a carrier, you must have your services or your system must be capable of enabling communication to pass over your system and for that communication to be intercepted. And once that communication becomes lawfully intercepted, for you to be able to transmit that information to the delivery points. And so again, this applies whether or not you are covered by a specific determination by the minister. So there's also the delivery capability, and that goes sort of hand in hand, and it's the capability of the telco system to be able to enable that lawfully intercepted information to be delivered to an interception agency. And this must occur from delivery points. And delivery points are, as they suggest, it's just locations that have been nominated by the carrier or the CSP, where intercepted information can be most conveniently transmitted to the interception agency. Now, once you notify what these delivery points are, interception agency might actually come back and say that it may reject your delivery points, in which case you'll have to nominate another area or another location. If your delivery point gets rejected again, then this agreement will be referred to ACMA for determination. So we've talked, and I've mentioned the next part quite a few times, the interception capability plan. Like I said earlier, there is no determination as of yet or currently that the minister has made as to what sort of capability is in place for ISPs, which means that every year and on the by the 1st of July every year, carriers and only nominated CSPs have to submit a written instrument setting out what sort of policies and systems that they have in place, so that they will be able to comply with their obligations under the Act. So in that, you have to specify what sort of systems, what sort of policies you have in place, as well as any sort of relevant developments that your company is proposing to implement within the 5 years following the plan, that if implemented would be likely to affect your interception capability, as well as a list of employers that will be responsible for the interception. This ICP must be approved by your CEO, and like I said again, it's due on the 1st of July every year to the Communications Access Coordinator. Just in the interest of time, I won't go into so much about data retention. You guys should all know what they are, that you are required to keep your data for 2 years and keep information and documents for 2 years. And I will go over onto costs, because I believe that is why we're all here today, legal interception on the cheap. So the cost of developing, installing, and maintaining your interception capability systems are imposed and borne by the carriers or the CSP. So interestingly though, the cost of delivery capabilities is actually incurred originally by the carrier or the CSP, but then can be recovered over time through the agency. And I'm sure we can discuss later in the Q&A how this works in practical senses. But yes, in terms of the interception capability systems itself, these are costs that are borne by the ISP, by the carrier, by the CSP. And I imagine which is why we're all here today. So I'm going to wrap up there, and I will pass on to Richard Nelson from the University of Waikato and the OpenLI team, where he'll be giving us a background about OpenLI. So thank you.
I think you're muted, Richard.
Right, so thank you for that, Sophia. OpenLI is a project. It's a collaboration between the University of Waikato and industry participants, particularly NZ participants in New Zealand. And I'm going to talk about how we got started, and then we're going to hand over to people who've done some of the work. So Sophia mentioned the Australian Act. In New Zealand, we have a similarly named Act, but it has an extra couple of letters, so we affectionately refer to it as TICSA. It was introduced in 2013, but at the time there was no specification or no regulation about formats or technical requirements for handing over intercept data. The regulations didn't come out till 4 years later in 2017. They were published, and they specified the ETSI standards. So the term lawful intercept is what is used in the ETSI standards, and that's why we call our project OpenLI for lawful intercept. So a week, I believe, after the regulations were published. Dave, who's going to talk later on, posted to the NZNOG mailing list, asking what people were doing and how they were going to meet the requirements. There was provoked quite a discussion on the list. Most people's reaction was, what? We didn't know about this, and we didn't understand that we were going to have to do ETSI requirements. And there was discussion about possible cheap options that turned out that really there weren't very many that existed anywhere. And so the discussion resolved that, you know, maybe people should work together to try and come up with a solution that would be cheaper than going out and buying a commercial solution. That the ones that people had found were available were sort of 6-7 figures and 7 figures at least. So out of that discussion came a group of sponsors who all provided money in order to create a new solution that would meet the requirements of the Act, the various ETSI specifications, and hopefully do so in a way that was cheaper. The money got given to us. We're a group called the WAND Group, which has had an acronym once, but we don't use it. The Network Research Group at the University of Waikato. And we'd done a lot of work capturing traffic and processing it and moving it around places. And so being able to do Lawful Intercept was very close to the experiences that we had. We put up a website and we talked to a bunch of people and promised that we were going to do stuff. We got some more sponsors and we got more cooperation from people in the industry. And we went on and eventually we delivered some code. The open part is that it's all published under a GPL license. I think that was January 2019. We promised or offered a talk to the linux.conf.au, and they said that they would take our talk as long as the code had been published. And so the publication was driven by that. But it's been adopted and is quite widely used by small and medium-sized service providers in New Zealand, and there've been a whole lot of releases since then. But all the coding work has been done by Shane, so I'm now going to hand over to him.
Thanks, Richard. I will just bring up my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Yes, so hello everyone, my name is Shane, and I'm going to talk a bit more about the technical requirements of LI and how OpenLI has been designed to meet those requirements. So firstly, a very quick intro to me. So I am the lead software developer for OpenLI. So I'm responsible for around 95% of the code in OpenLI. So I know my way around it fairly well. And I've been working for WAND for a very long time, over 15 years as a research programmer, specializing in writing code to build internet measurement systems, specifically those that deal with packet captures, analysis, and storage. So I was kind of the perfect person to take the job of OpenLI on when it came up. And I've been doing that for sort of the past 4 years. So as we begin, let's talk a little bit more about the ETSI standards for LI. So these come from the European Telecommunications Standards Institute. So they're a standardization body somewhat akin to the IETF or the 3GPP groups. But their standards for LI seem to have really been picked up by a lot of other countries, been seen as well designed and comprehensive. And that this is not just within Europe itself, but also throughout Latin America, Africa, and the Asia Pacific region. And as you've seen, New Zealand has mandated the use of the ETSI standards for LI. In Australia, my understanding is that ETSI is accepted, but is not necessarily the only mandated standard. But as I said, they are very comprehensive, and so it's a good starting point. There are a few exceptions. The USA, Russia, and China all have their own LI standards, because of course they're big enough and authoritarian enough to get away with that. I should stop doing it. So there are a number of standards documents to pore through when it comes to learning about ETSI and Lawful Intercept. So there's a few general documents which cover Lawful Intercept for networks overall. And then there are also very specific standards for each of the different underlying communication technologies that you can be intercepting. So there's a different standard for email, there's a different standard for voice over IP, there's separate standards for mobile and so on. And so what you end up with is each of those technologies requires a slightly different implementation as well, to be able to comply with the standard. So boiling all that down, there are a few key requirements in ETSI that an LI system needs to meet. And the first of these, and the one that sort of perhaps caught the New Zealand operators most by surprise, was that all of the intercepted communications need to be delivered to the law enforcement agencies in real time. And in most cases, for most agencies that they're dealing with, such as police, that means that they have to deliver the intercepted communications over the public internet using some sort of encrypted and secure TCP/IP tunnel. But it is also possible, of course, that more agencies that have a greater need for secrecy may have more strict requirements. For instance, you may have to deliver the real-time communications over a closed circuit. There are two separate handovers or deliverables for each ETSI interception. So the first of these is the handover that delivers intercept-related information, or IRIs. And this is sort of the metadata about the intercept that's taken place. So in the case of an IP session, for instance, the IRIs would be generated when the customer logs onto your network. They would tell it what IP address that particular target was assigned, how it was assigned, when they logged off, as well as regular updates while they're still on the network. For voice calls, this would be essentially the SIP signaling that's associated with the call. And yeah, any sort of information that provides context to the interception. The other handover is for the communication contents, or CCs, and this is really just the intercepted traffic that was sent to or from the intercept target. For each record or packet that you intercept, they need to be wrapped in a strictly defined and unique to Lawful Intercept encapsulation format that includes a huge number of fields, really. And this is necessary for the intercept to be able to withstand scrutiny in court. So all of this additional information that is wrapped around these intercept records includes things like timestamps, include the network operator that performed the intercept, where in that network the interception took place. For mobile intercepts in particular, any geolocation information about the target at the time the intercept took place, and also some sequence numbering so that any missing or reordered intercept records can be identified at the point that the law enforcement agency receives them. Another very important ETSI requirement is to avoid missing any packets at all costs. So this works in a couple of ways. One is that obviously the performance of your lawful interception system must be able to keep up with the pace of your own network. So you must be able to capture the traffic of your targets at whatever line rate those targets are achieving. But it also means that the internal processing of your system has to also be able to keep up as well, and you can't be losing track of any intercepted packets. The other side of this is that all of the components in your interception system must also be fault tolerant. And what that means is, for instance, if the connectivity of your handovers to the law enforcement agencies fail, and if they're going over the public internet, there is always going to be a chance that they will fail, then your system needs to be buffering any intercepted records internally. So you can't afford to just drop things on the floor because something went wrong. Your system needs to try and keep track of all of that. So buffering in memory might buy you a few minutes for the connectivity to come back up, but realistically, you need to account for potentially longer outages. And so you'll need some sort of buffering that's more permanent, such as to disk. There's also a key requirement that the privacy of any other users of the network must be protected, right? So your customer session tracking needs to be immaculate within your lawful intercept system, right? You can't accidentally intercept traffic for any other customers and deliver that to an agency. That would generally be very frowned upon. And you also need to be able to follow any intercept targets who happen to change location or IP address within your network. So you need to account for the fact that your targets may be dynamically moving around. And so this is where we come to OpenLI. OpenLI itself is an open source implementation of these ETSI LI standards. And as Richard mentioned, we're really aiming at the small to medium-sized ISPs to give them an option that is not a horrendously expensive commercial solution, right? So if you find yourself in the position where you need some system that will let you comply with LI regulations, but you, for instance, only do a handful of intercepts a year at most, then it's not really feasible for you to be spending a vast sum of money on a solution. OpenLI may be a much better option for you. The OpenLI software itself is divided into 3 different components. The first of these is the provisioner, which is the centralized manager for the whole system. And any sort of day-to-day interaction that you have with OpenLI is going to go via the provisioner. And its role is really just to tell the other components what they need to be doing. The collectors are the sort of distributed workhorses of the OpenLI system. So you can have any number of these scattered throughout your network, and they do the work of looking at traffic, deciding whether it needs to be intercepted. If it does need to be intercepted, they'll encode it according to the ETSI standards, and then pass it on to the final component, which is called the mediator, which is in charge of delivering those intercept records to the LEAs. So in the Australian parlance, you would say that the mediator is essentially your delivery point. And here's roughly how a typical OpenLI deployment might look visually. Dave will walk through some slightly more specific examples in a bit, but here's generally speaking how it works. So you have the provisioner, which the operator configures with details of what intercepts they want to undertake, and maybe a little bit of extra information about their network that will help OpenLI understand what's going on. So for instance, you would tell the provisioner the IP addresses of your SIP servers, for instance, so that the collectors know any traffic they see from those IP addresses is likely to be SIP traffic. At each major interception point within our network, you might install a collector and mirror into that collector the traffic that would be a candidate for interception. The collectors look at that traffic. If they find things that they need to intercept, then they'll turn those into ETSI compliant RIs and CCs, hand them off to the mediator, which will then forward them on to the requesting agency. So what do you get with OpenLI? Well, the first point is compliance, right? So OpenLI, as it stands right now, is compliant with the ETSI standards for IP traffic intercepts, voice over IP call intercepts, and interceptions of mobile data over 3G and 4G. and I'm working on the email interception support right now. We've already been successfully deployed at a number of New Zealand ISPs, so we know that the OpenLI software itself is capable of interoperating with our authorities, as well as the authorities, as well as that it is indeed standards compliant. Of course, the big one is with OpenLI, you get a low cost option, right? The software itself is free. It's available on GitHub. You can download it and do whatever you want with it. It's designed to run on typical commodity hardware using the Linux operating system. And if you need software support, maybe you want to request a feature or you run into some bugs because there's some particular special case in your network that we don't account for, then that's something that you can subscribe to for a relatively nominal fee. If you want to place your OpenLI, if you'd like to have a third-party deal with your OpenLI deployment entirely, then there's also third-party consultancy services available. One of the key selling points of OpenLI is that it's designed to be very flexible in how you deploy it. So we have as you've seen, we've split the software components into separate parts to perform the various different roles. And you can distribute those collector nodes throughout your network such that wherever you place them makes the most sense for your network. The software itself can run inside VMs or containers. You don't have to have bare metal if you don't need it. And we've also placed a simple standardized REST API in front of the provisioner, so you can configure intercepts using your own web interface as well. Performance-wise, in testing, we've been able to achieve multi-gigabit sustained interception on an individual collector node. This is with some pretty old hardware now, so I suspect if you went out and bought some decent hardware that you might be able to get even better performance out of OpenLI. From our experiences in packet capture research and so on, we've ensured that we've built in support for a lot of modern high performance packet capture techniques like DPDK and XDP as well. So you can use those directly through OpenLI. Of course, with the code being open source, anyone can take a look at it. It can be audited, and you can at least be fairly confident that I'm not trying to sneak any hidden backdoors or other nasties past you. Internally, all of the communications between OpenLI components can be TLS encrypted. You provide the certificates and OpenLI will do the rest. The provisioner REST API has authentication capabilities using either an API key or HTTP digest authentication. And the overall architecture is designed such that a deployment is inherently mostly secure. So there's no need for anyone to connect into your any of your OpenLI components from outside of your network at all. So that the only outbound connection that needs to be made is from your mediator back to the agencies, which again should be a secure tunnel as well. So you can quite easily firewall your whole OpenLI system off from the rest of the world without too many worries. One of the big features that our initial users requested from us was the ability for OpenLI to interoperate with the LI mirroring features that were already present in some of their vendor devices. So you may have come across some of these things like Juniper JMirror or FlowTap or the TZSP feature on MikroTik Router OS. And so these are non-ETSI compliant mirroring capabilities that are present on these devices that are marketed as LI, Lawful Intercept, but they aren't really, that useful to you in the context that agencies require. So OpenLI can effectively act as a translator from these mirroring formats into the ETSI standard. So we support the formats for Juniper, Nokia, and the MikroTik devices right now. Cisco might be coming soon, depending on if we can partner with someone who really wants it. And finally, and just in terms of the deployment, so we try to make this very easy for you, even though we do leave a lot of it up to you as the operator. So we package the software for a large number of popular Linux distributions, Debian, Ubuntu, some Red Hat derivatives, and so on. We provide documentation as well as a fairly comprehensive tutorial that I spent a large part of last year working on. And included in that tutorial is a containerized training lab with a series of practical exercises that are designed to give you some hands-on experience with OpenLI without actually having to touch your own network. It's all built into the lab. But ultimately, it's up to you to figure out how to integrate OpenLI into your network. But having said that, the user community that we've established so far in New Zealand is very helpful and always keen to help out and answer questions. And if worst comes to worst, then you would hire someone like Dave, who's about to speak after me to give you a hand with designing and deploying OpenLI for you. And I'll hand you over to Dave.
Thank you, Shane. And I assume I'm sharing correctly now. Cool. So I've been told we're running slightly behind, so I'll see if I can make up any time in my session. So first of all, I'm here to talk to you about how to implement OpenLI into an ISP and turn Shane's software into something that can be used to sort of conform to everything you need to do. So first of all, about me, I'm a network consultant from Searchlight. Through that role, I consult service providers and to enterprises. As Richard mentioned earlier, I helped to found and start OpenLI. Since Shane's software became usable, I've been involved in actually deploying OpenLI into many New Zealand ISPs, and I've sort of racked up quite a bit of experience in doing that. I don't officially work for the University of Waikato, and I don't officially have any connection to OpenLI, but I tend to be known as an industry advocate or a token figurehead of the OpenLI project. So as Shane mentioned, OpenLI is very modular. No ISP is the same. And what that means is whilst there's no standard deployment for how OpenLI is done, you can deploy OpenLI in any way into your network that suits your network topology and enables you to get the data into the necessary components of OpenLI. So Shane's already touched upon this, but the key things are to get an intercept working for an ISP, you need to capture CCs or communication contents, which will always be IP data or RTP in the case of voice. And you'll also need to capture IRI, so intercept related information. And that will generally be radius data or SIP data in the case of voice. You'll also need to transport that data to a law enforcement agency. Now, we're quite used to doing that as ETSI being streamed over an internet-based VPN. This could also be done over private interconnect, but also there could be options like doing rolling PCAPs available on an SFTP server. I believe Australia is quite open to how this could be done. So you need to deploy at least one provisioner, at least one mediator, and one or more collectors to make OpenLI go. With a provisioner, you typically will only need one, and that could be a virtual machine, very simple. With a mediator, that could be a virtual machine. You need to really look at the throughput the mediator will be producing, like how many intercepts will be running at the time, how fast the internet connections will be. The mediator might need a public IP if you're going to run an IPsec VPN directly to an agency, or maybe you'll need a separate firewall sitting in front of that. With collectors, you might have one collector or you might have many. There's many different ways to do this. If you're doing decent speed broadband and you're doing potentially multiple intercepts at once, I'd assume you probably want to have a physical collector with a 10 gig NAC that supports DPDK. However, I'm going to talk about some virtual options very shortly. So briefly deploying a provisioner, as I said, you need to install one. You can do a very basic install as per the wiki, generate some TLS certs for the internal communication. It's really good to keep everything secure. In the configuration, enable TLS. You can enable a law enforcement agency called localhost, and I'll get to why we do that shortly. And also you can turn on a law enforcement agency called PCAP disk. And that's just a way of actually writing your LI data or intercept data to PCAPs and rolling PCAPs of that where someone can retrieve them regularly. A mediator, most deployments I've done only have one mediator, but I get that Australia is a bit larger geographically than New Zealand. There might be a need to have mediators, because that's your delivery point to agencies in multiple places, or maybe you might have a need to have mediators close to certain agencies or close to certain sort of delivery points. But again, with mediator, you install it as per the wiki, generate some TLS certs, enable TLS, configure a PCAP folder, which is just a folder on the server where you'll be writing the PCAPs to. And also on the mediator, it's very useful to install a tool that Shane has also been very involved in called libtrace. So that's just a simple DB package or similar that you can install. Deploying a collector. As I said before, there's lots of different ways to kind of do collectors. I'll touch upon this again soon. Do you need a collector with a 10 gig NIC? I'd say most likely you do. Kind of depends on how quick your NBN is and things like that. To install this, you'll install DPTK on your collector first of all. If you're using it, you can then install OpenLI collectors. And I'll touch upon ways you can actually use collectors to make this really easy for you in a moment. So let's move on to some deployment concepts on how to put OpenLI into an ISP. So going back to what we've touched on a few times now, in terms of a data intercept, so just an IP intercept, you've got CCs or communication contents, and that's your IP data, and you've got IRIs or metadata, which is your radius data. So a typical oversimplified ISP deployment, you've got users talking to a BNG, and you need to get that user data out of the BNG and into a collector. So what you need to do is effectively establish, most likely initially, a 10 gig physical connection between a BNG and a collector. And then you need to tell the BNG to stream that user's traffic to a collector. Now, at least in the Juniper world, that's done using a feature called FlowTap Lite on Juniper BNGs. You need a license called a SSP or Secure Subscriber Policy license. And then vendors like Cisco and Nokia have their own kind of ways to do very similar things. The key thing is you're tending to turn this on using radius and COAs or change of attributes. And this means you can tell the BNG to stream the user's data seamlessly, and you can turn it off on the fly during a sort of existing user session. And also an intercept will also be provisioned on a provisioner. If you've got an ISP with static IPs, so no BNGs in use, statically configured to users, you've tended got a collector off to the side, and you've got your users talking via a VLAN or similar to a gateway or a router. So really you can intercept that data either in a midpoint on a VLAN in your network, a port tap or similar, or again, you could do a tap or similar on the actual layer 3 interface on your gateway. You just need to stream that into any collector, physical collector, virtual collector, and you'll get your necessary data into that collector. A feature Shane touched upon again, if you've got any smaller WISPs in the room or people using microtics a lot, we can use the microtik tunneling protocol to stream that information from a microtik switch or a microtik router into a collector to get that information. So with static IPs, there's no BNG or radius activation. You're really just enabling a tap to get the data into a collector, and then you're enabling an intercept on a provisioner. So carrying on with what makes an intercept up for an ISP, the key thing we haven't talked about yet is IRIs or radius. So here's a very typical ISP setup again, users talking to a BNG, and the BNG is using a radius server for authentication and accounting, and you've got accounting record streaming from the BNG to the radius server. My first approach here was just to basically take a port tap in the middle of the network, stream that data into a collector, job's done, you've got all the data in the collector. However, a lot of people run their radius software on a Linux system, and OpenLI will also run on Linux. So another approach is to install the collector software onto your radius infrastructure and tell the collector software to snoop the interface that your radius infrastructure uses. The side consequence of that is anyone on your radius infrastructure can see the intercepts going on. So it kind of leads to this concept where you have your standard radius server down the bottom here. You kind of have a secret radius server where you just stream your accounting records to, install your collector on that, and you kind of got your secrecy in a very simple deployment. So in summary, there's many ways to get radius into a collector, and the way you do that will depend on your secrecy requirements, privacy requirements, and just generally how your ISP is set up. Okay, touching on voice real briefly here. With voice, most people know we've got SIP and RTP data, oversimplified diagram here with users chatting using SIP and RTP to a SIP server. Bringing that into a lawful intercept kind of sense, your SIP is IRI, metadata, your RTP is your contents of that communication. So again, my old-fashioned approach here is just to find a tap point in your network or potentially on the layer 3 gateway on your SIP server, stream that into your collector somehow, and job's done. But going back to my radius concept before, really, if you've got a Linux-based SBC or SIP server, you can install your collector software on there, tell it to snoop the nick in question, and you've got all that data coming into the collector. Another option I've seen recently is with a Windows-based SIP server. Someone's deployed a Linux VM in that, put a NIC into promiscuous mode, told it to sort of look at all those packets, do some bridging, and again, you can get those packets into a collector very simply. Testing, don't want to overemphasize this one, it's very important. You've got this all deployed, it should work, but how do you know it's going to work when you get served a warrant? Two real key basic things to do to start with. First of all, that rolling PCAP or that PCAP disk agency I talked about before. As soon as you've got this all working, you can enable an intercept and make it stream to your local PCAP disk folder. That way you can check your PCAPs, check they've got in what you kind of think should be in there. Next up, you can install the libtrace tools I mentioned before on your mediator. And you can set up this localhost agency that I talked about before, where you tell your mediator to stream everything to a localhost. So it's not streaming it down a VPN, it's streaming it locally. Then you can run this tool that I've mentioned on my slide here, trace packet dump, to actually basically run that locally on your mediator, and out will pop human readable data showing you that your ETSI intercept is streaming to localhost and working. In terms of getting this to the law enforcement agencies, we basically don't know much about how this works in Australia, and I'm very interested to hear from Mark and other people in terms of how do you do the VPNs over the public internet? Do you do private interconnects? Do you allow SFTP servers with rolling PCAPs on? And also how this kind of works in your landscape. Like, do we just deal with the federal police? Do we have to deal with state police as well? Do we need to do interceptions within states due to that? And what other agencies kind of lurk around in that kind of spook sphere that we might need to deal with? We're just very interested in understanding that. And what I'm trying to do here is that similar to Shane's diagram. This is kind of just what an ISP might look like once you've got OpenLI deployed. You've got your provisioner I've mentioned. You've got your mediator down here that will stream everything to the agency involved. What I'm showing over here is a very standard POP. You've got your BNG in a POP, you've got your radius server running a collector, you've got a collector that takes your physical link in from the BNG to get the packets. Same over here, same kind of POP. But I'm just showing, we'll call this the El Cheapo POP in this ISP, where they don't have the money or the budget or the space to have a physical collector in that POP. So they're actually just taking the BNG interface, streaming it over a sort of layer 2 pseudo wire and popping it into another collector in their network. So anyway, that's a really, really brief kind of intro into putting OpenLI into an ISP. And now I'm going to hand over to Richard just to talk briefly about the future of the OpenLI project. Thank you, Richard.
Okay, so very, very quickly about the future. The technical future, we're very driven on what in particular users want. You know, we don't have a network we can test this on, and we're not an ISP that has a direct relationship with law enforcement agencies, so we rely on the ISPs that are using it to test with them as well. There's a bunch of possibilities that I won't go through, but we're very driven by what people want, and we're pretty keen to do as much as possible for the project. Financial, this is more difficult. You know, the initial sponsorship lasted a year and ended up in the first delivery. And since then, the project has survived because it was part of the university research group, and that was justified because we got some grants, and we've started selling support contracts that Shane mentioned, and that's continued on. But COVID has been very hard on university budgets, and so the university is not really going to support the project, or is not going to support the project after the end of this year. And so we need to come up with a way of making it long-term sustainable. And we want to do that in a way that maintains the community driven and the open source approach. So we've been talking to commercialization people, and they're not very keen on that, but we think it's better for our users if that's what we can do. And so, we're here because we're really keen to see what we could do with Australian ISPs if we can provide something that is of actual value. It says there the authorities are tight-lipped, but that's really, we failed to understand what the requirements are by looking online, and so we need to talk to people. But the lessons are that industry can work together and achieve something that's quite useful in this space by doing things collaboratively with the law enforcement agencies. And we need someone to kick it off, and we can really get going.
Sorry, you're muted, Narelle.
Of course, I would be that person, wouldn't I? Look, thank you so much, Richard, Shane, Sophia, and Dave, for that really interesting opening to Lawful Intercept and a way to do it. I did want to quickly introduce folks in the time we've got remaining to Mark Parncut. Mark is the officer in charge of surveillance integration delivery with responsibility for the collection, processing and presentation of Lawful Intercept at the Australian Federal Police. He has a background as a software developer, systems administrator and digital forensic analysis in law enforcement for the past 7.5 years. And in the private sector prior to that. Mark is passionate about the difference that Lawful Intercept makes to law enforcement operations and has contributed to innovation in both technology and policy through interagency and industry forums. So we're really pleased to have Mark join us for this Q&A. Unfortunately, he was a late addition, so we couldn't manage to squeeze him in any more sort of presenter type form, but we're really, really pleased to have him. Now, we are going to move into Q&A and we're going to stop the recording as of now, please.